When you're collecting the surface sediment, many of the components from the square rod system can be adapted to build a surface coring system. The only additional component that you need is a short square rod. Here you can see how we will assemble the surface coring device. You'll start by attaching a nut to the top of the short square rod. You can hand tighten that on. Once the nut is in place, you can attach the drive rod connector. This connector adapts the threads on the square rod to the correct size for the drive rods. You will hand tighten and then snug the nut against the drive rod connector using a wrench. Next, we'll put the coring head onto the short square rod. When you do this, you want to make sure that you're maintaining the proper orientation. You should be sure to keep the flanges on the side of the short square rod up against the stops at the top of the coring head. At the bottom, you'll put on a lock washer and another nut to secure the head in place. You'll thread the nut on by hand and then tighten it down using a crescent wrench. Once you have the coring head assembled, you can then start to build your coring device. To do this, you'll put the Bolivia collar onto the coring head. Make sure that you're using the screw holes that are recessed to attach the first 3 screws. This way, they do not interfere with the polycarb tubing you will slide over the collar later. Put the screws in loosely to start and then tighten them up using a screwdriver. This gives you a little bit of play in case you need to adjust the position of the coring collar to tighten them. Once all of the screws are in place, the coring head can be slid onto the coring tube. The tube for the surface corer needs to be drilled in the same way as it does for the Bolivia corer, but a tube of any length can be used as you are not limited by the length of the square rod. The piston cable slides through the hole at the top of the coring head. Add enough cable until you can reach the cable at the bottom of the tube to pull it out the end. Once the cable is in place, you can attach the piston to the bottom of the coring device. The cable will pass through the hole at the top of the piston, and then we will tie a figure-8 knot to keep the cable from sliding back through the head of the piston. Once you've tied the knot, you'll pull it tight up against the head, and then you can use a piece of electrical tape to secure the knot and the tail against the central part of the piston. This keeps the end of the piston cable from interfering with the rubbers on the piston while you're coring. You can see that the piston is currently loose because the nuts in the center move freely and there's no pressure being applied to the rubbers on the piston to tighten them. In this configuration, the piston should slide freely in and out of the coring tube. We will need to adjust the tension on these such that the black rubber gaskets push against the core tube enough to form a black ring all the way around the inside of the coring tube. We want to make sure that they're tight enough that the piston is providing enough suction to keep material in the coring device, but not so much that it becomes difficult to push the piston into the coring tube. A 3/4 inch crescent wrench is the appropriate size for the nuts on the piston. You'll often need to slide the piston in and out a few times to reach the appropriate tightness. Building the surface core, you have to be careful not to push the piston in too far, as the square rod is not inside to keep the piston from moving up the tube. If you push the piston in too far, a vice grip can be used to grab onto the nose cone at the end of the piston and slide it out. Be careful when putting the piston in not to pinch your fingers between the wall of the piston and the end of the polycarb tube.